Hey class, how are you doing? Starting off in hormone responses to exercise lecture. The main things that I'm wanting to accomplish in this, it's quite a few slides and different concepts that we need to go over. So be sure to take breaks whenever you need to. And also, some of you who think I talk slow, which I understand I do on occasion, you can alter the settings here on YouTube and make it to where I'm talking at like 1.25 or 1.5 speed. So go ahead and do that if you don't want to sit through my long, laborious speaking. Because it's, I think I still sound human at 1.25. 1.5, I think it started sounding kind of weird, but maybe you're into that. So all right. So with this, what I want to do is talk about hormones, receptors, and signaling cascades. So the main things there are what determines hormone concentrations, and what determines the effect of a hormone on whatever the target tissue is. And overall, there's about 3 mechanisms of action that hormones effectively tell different tissues what to do. And we have some fast-acting hormones, slow-acting hormones. Really just a lot of it is around regulating blood glucose. That'll come up. And then we're going to talk about the main functions of hormones overall, and then some specific hormones in relation to both exercise duration, so the longer we exercise what happens, and also what happens in terms of exercise intensity. So the more difficult that we exercise, like you run faster, lift weights harder, or what have you, what's occurring there. So you can read through those objectives and outline if you want. But here, just kind of some simple stuff. So neuroendocrinology overall, and this is just kind of some background stuff within these whole topics. Not really important things on this slide yet, but the neuroendocrine system. So the endocrine system releases hormones, the nervous system releases neurotransmitters, endocrine glands release hormones directly into the blood, and hormones alter the activity of tissues that possess receptors to which the hormone can bind. So the big thing there is that a tissue can only experience an effect of a hormone if it has a specific receptor for it. So a lot of this is kind of like enzymes with that whole lock and key model. So if a tissue doesn't have a particular receptor, then it can't do anything with that hormone. The classic example that I like to use is that there's a hormone called glucagon, and effectively it's the counter to insulin, and skeletal muscle does not have a glucagon receptor, so no matter how much glucagon is circulating in the bloodstream, the muscle really won't detect it or realize it. Now, other hormones functionally do similar things to glucagon, like epinephrine for skeletal muscle, which actually has a fairly good affinity for skeletal muscle, so we'll talk about that. But there's different classes of hormones. Really, there's about 2 that I want you to be aware of, so peptide hormones and steroid hormones. So the idea here, a peptide, meaning protein, a peptide hormone more or less just means that it's derived from proteins or amino acids, and that typically means that it's water soluble. So those hormones can only get into a tissue via a transporter. Or have an effect via some type of transport protein, because the cell membrane is essentially like lipophilic, meaning that amino acids or proteins cannot just directly go into a cell. Now, on the other end, a steroid hormone, meaning that it is derived from cholesterol or from some type of lipid. Due to that being its structure, it can actually just transverse the membrane of, say, a skeletal muscle or whatever, and have an effect on the inside of it. So the main difference here is that peptide hormones bind to an external receptor, whereas steroid hormones actually bind to an internal receptor within a particular tissue type. So here, I wanted to hit home this point of transport and specificity. So right here we can see, like, say, a secreting cell like an endocrine gland. It'll release a hormone into your bloodstream, and really just for you to get an understanding of how this works, the hormone is going through there, and let's say that this is a peptide hormone. It's going to bind to a external receptor on a target cell, and then it's going to have some type of effect within there. And one of the main effects that we worry about would be like breaking down glucose faster. So that could be something going on. Now, in terms of specificity, this is what I want you to see here, that say if a particular target cell has a given receptor type to like a circle but not a triangle, then it's going to have an effect from circle but not the triangle. This one could have both. This one may only have the triangle. So this is really like a fairly low-level way of understanding it, but I do think that we lose the appreciation for how, like the structure of different hormones or different molecules within our body, like their shape actually does matter in many cases because, well, like how I said prior, glucagon, which is going to be a really important thing from the alpha cells of the pancreas, that has no effect on skeletal muscle. So just because it doesn't have a glucagon receptor. So I think that is, an interesting thing to ponder about and stuff. All right, so here is one of the first big things that we really need to know. Very extremely testable material right here. So blood hormone concentration, what determines it? So the effect of a hormone on a tissue is frequently determined by blood hormone concentration. So it's determined by 4 particular things. So the first one being rate of secretion. So I mean that's really just the creation of it, or it being put into the bloodstream from the particular endocrine gland. So just rate of production, more or less. So rate of production, secretion, something like that. How much does the endocrine gland make? Endocrine gland, sorry, difficulty with words. The next one being rate of excretion or removal. So how quickly does the particular tissue or some other tissue like actually metabolize it and break it down to where it no longer has a particular effect. Next thing being quantity of transport protein. So how many transport proteins are actually on whatever cell type that there are. So if there's a greater amount of transport proteins on a given cell, then it can get into the cell quite a bit faster, so the excretion, conceivably would go up. Another thing that, and this is more or less just mathematical, but changes in plasma volume. So whenever we talk about hormone concentration, effectively it's how much of the hormone is inside of a particular liter or so of blood. So like milligrams per deciliter, like whatever we want to think about within that. So if you get dehydrated and have less blood, your plasma volume goes down, the fluid part of your blood goes down, then that increases the concentration overall. So think about the hormone as the numerator and the amount of fluid or blood that you have as the denominator, and if you decrease the denominator, then, well, I mean, like that alters the ratio. So one particular thing that like say with medications that a lot of people talk about is make sure that you have sufficient fluids, like you drink enough water with whatever medications that you're taking, because that could drastically alter the concentration of whatever you're ingesting or taking, and that could alter, like have a more profound effect overall. So there are 4 things: rate of secretion, metabolism, quantity of transport protein, and changes or alterations in plasma volume. All of that determines the blood hormone concentration. So here's just an example of a particular hormone that I'm fairly fascinated with, insulin. And some of the reasons that I'm fascinated with it are any time that there are lots of, I don't know, issues in society, like we talk about death rates from different ailments or what have you, and at the time of recording this video, I'm not 100% sure on this, but it's fairly close. Type 2 diabetes, around 90 to 95% of people in the United States with diabetes have type 2 diabetes, so it's the vast majority of it. Type 2 diabetes is likely the seventh leading cause of death, and I believe it's around 79,000, around 80,000 individuals annually per year die from complications with type 2 diabetes, and we don't hear about it very much, and it's one of the ailments that exercise really helps quite a bit. And you know, within an exercise physiology class, granted, like many of us are concerned with high-level athletes, but what if we could write an exercise prescription for an individual that prevents them from getting diabetes? So here are just like a couple of things going on with that, like insulin. If we're having like high amounts of insulin, that's called hyperinsulinemia, and that's typically not a great thing. And that, the endocrine gland here is the pancreas, particularly the beta cells of the pancreas are making insulin. Two things that increase insulin, glucose. I mean, I think this is somewhat obvious that like eating carbohydrates increases insulin, and actually eating amino acids or proteins along with carbohydrates has a slightly more profound effect on insulin production. A couple of other things, sympathetic or fight or flight neurons seem to dampen the pancreas's ability to stimulate insulin. Parasympathetic neurons, rest and digest, so-called, right, seem to increase insulin. Plasma epinephrine related to sympathetic neurons, that seems to decrease it. And other hormones, can have like additive or, counteracting effects, like glucagon would have a counteracting effect, for example. So, I mean, some implications here would just be, if someone has diabetes, maybe don't eat simple carbohydrates and proteins together because insulin then goes really high, maybe prior to eating something, they would do a little bit of exercise, get a little bit of sympathetic nervous system going, and epinephrine increases whenever we exercise. So, I don't know, just some relatively interesting things there, I think. Here, let's go and move on into hormone-receptor interactions. So hormones only affect tissue with specific receptors. We've went over that already. So like four things that determine the concentration of the hormones, which, really important. Go back and review that a bunch prior to our tests, right? But then what determines the magnitude of effect on the particular tissue? So the concentration of the hormone, those four things that we talked about a little while ago, go back and review those. I'm not going to repeat them right now because I just said it. The number of receptors on a cell, and also the affinity of the receptor for the hormone. So due to some structural or charges, like a receptor might have a greater affinity for a particular hormone or a lower affinity for a particular hormone. So that can really go all over the place. So these are the three things that I want you to know for the magnitude of effect on of a hormone on a particular tissue type. And frequently, here's these two different concepts. So we have a downregulation or a decrease in receptor number in response to high concentration of particular hormones. And so this, going back to type 2 diabetes, if we have a lot of insulin all the time, then frequently we'll actually reduce the amount of insulin receptors on skeletal muscle, fat tissue, and so on. And then that means that people's blood sugar starts creeping up because it can't, blood sugar can't be taken out of the bloodstream because, well, the various tissues lost all of their insulin receptors, so that's kind of a bad thing, right? Now, upregulation, so an increase in receptor number in response to low concentration of the hormone. So, like this, again, for example, if you do a lot of fasting, a lot of exercise, you don't get a lot of insulin in your bloodstream, then we're actually going to increase the insulin receptor number on top of skeletal muscle. So, yeah, I'm sorry that I keep on using that example, but I think it's really important for us to know. Hormones, they typically do 3 separate things, and I want you to know these, and there's really only a little bit that I want you to know with too much of this. But the first one being altering activity of DNA to modify protein synthesis. So this typically binds to some flavor of receptor, then that stimulates transcription and subsequently translation. This is what we think about with testosterone, estrogen, both being steroid hormones. The next one being activating second messengers via a G protein, which we'll look at that. The cyclic AMP second messenger cascade is really one big thing that we're going to need to know going forward, because that has quite a bit to do with our response to exercise. And we'll talk about that whenever we get there. And then lastly, altering membrane transport. So altering, say, insulin, for example. So right here, this is essentially how a steroid hormone works. So we have a particular lipophilic hormone, testosterone, estrogen, whatever we want to think there. There's a particular amount in the blood. It goes right through the cell membrane. It binds to a receptor. And then once it's bound to that receptor, it can go into the nucleus, alter some transcription. Then we have a new particular mRNA, messenger RNA, right? And then that goes to a ribosome, protein synthesis, so on and so forth. That's the same song and dance that we were talking about in genetics. Now, this one right here, I really want us to know. Cyclic AMP, this second messenger mechanism, like a G protein coupled receptor, that's what that stands for. And there's a few hormones within here that I want you to know, like adenylate cyclase and protein kinase A. So a couple of things that are going on here. There's this alpha, beta, and gamma subunit. I don't think it's particularly important for us to know all of that, but really what this is doing overall is stimulating a phosphorylation cascade, which can increase the rate at which we break down muscle glycogen. And that being really important for fueling our skeletal muscle during exercise. So this is effectively the cascade that I want you to know. So the hormone binds to a G protein receptor, G protein is activated, G protein subunits activate adenylate cyclase, then adenylate cyclase breaks down ATP to cyclic AMP, and then cyclic AMP binds to protein kinase A, thereby activating it, and protein kinase A, pKa, phosphorylates certain enzymes, so like phosphofructokinase, for example, the rate-limiting enzyme in glycolysis to really turn that up, or glycogen phosphorylase, the first enzyme in breaking down muscle glycogen. Then we have a cellular response, and with kind of us being muscle-centric in a way. That's how all of that is going. Now, how this kind of works, I just want you to get like an appreciation for like the amplification, because this is pretty intense. So say like a receptor binds to a G protein, then the G protein activates a particular amount of adenylate cyclase, and then that activates a certain amount of cyclic AMP, and then that activates a particular amount of protein kinase A, and then protein kinase A phosphorylates a bunch of stuff. So this is almost like jumping from here to here. If you've ever heard the, I don't know, like people talk about like, what if you call two friends and each one of them calls two friends, and then each one of them calls two friends? That's kind of how I think about this. Now, I don't care if you know where the amplification happens and where it doesn't happen. I just want you to get an appreciation for, like, one, itsy bitsy hormone, and I don't know, let's say in this case, epinephrine or adrenaline if you want to be British. It binds to a particular receptor, and then it's going to end up activating a fair amount of adenylate cyclase, a lot of cyclic AMP, and then we're just breaking down tons of glycogen. It's super awesome. At least in my view it is. Now phospholipase 3 or IP3, PIP2, whatever, this one, I just want you to be aware that this one is somewhat of a thing. Within regard to exercise, we care a little bit less about it, but if you go on to graduate school, you will hear this. It's virtually a similar song and dance, except instead of adenylate cyclase, it's phospholipase C, and that binds to, like, well, it has some alteration with something called PIP2, and then there's this IP3, inositol phosphate. I'm not saying it right, but it's close enough. There's an activation within, like, particular diacylglycerols within the cell membrane. There's a binding to protein kinase C instead of protein kinase A. IP3 binds to the endoplasmic reticulum, which is where all the calcium is stored. Then that's where calcium ions come out, and then those calcium ions bind to particular things, alter some charges, and then we have another cellular response. It's effectively doing very similar things, except it's using a few more intricacies within, and utilizing the endoplasmic reticulum. But overall, it's another way to stimulate phosphorylation cascade. So that one, don't worry about memorizing that one. For sure, the cyclic AMP, I want us to know that. And this one right here, I'm going a little bit long on a couple of these things. So, like, check out this insulin receptor. I think this is fairly great. So insulin binds to particular things. There's responses. Different subunits get activated. Then glycogen synthase gets activated, and then, like, glucose, whenever it comes into the cell, then we start putting it into glycogen. So it's fairly interesting there. All right. So hormones regulation and action. So hormones are secreted from endocrine glands. We've talked about that quite a bit. Here are the main endocrine glands that we're going to be interested in. So the hypothalamus overall, but the anterior and posterior pituitary glands. Only two hormones I want you to know there. Thyroid, parathyroid glands. Well, I mean, thyroid hormone I want you to know about, but not a whole bunch. Adrenal glands and the pancreas, those are going to be really important for us going forward. There we go. Awesome. Okay. So the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. So, okay, first off, what we need to understand. The hypothalamus, it's frequently called the, thermostat of the body. So it does control the secretion of different types of pituitary glands. But then whenever we get down to it, there's functionally two different aspects to the pituitary gland. So there's the anterior one. Most things are coming from the anterior pituitary gland, but the adrenocorticotropic hormone, that is important. FSH, luteinizing hormone, thyroid stimulating hormone, all of these are important. But in regard to exercise, we're really probably having the largest effect on growth hormone, which any of us who are somewhat in the know about what growth hormone does, I think it might be a little bit surprising what its primary functions and roles are. Like we'll get into that here in a little bit. So that's the main one that I want you to know is being secreted from the anterior pituitary gland. Now for the posterior pituitary gland, the main thing that I want you to know here is antidiuretic hormone. And something that you might not know is, I'm sorry I always point out the differences between British people and us, but in Great Britain, antidiuretic hormone is frequently called vasopressin. So if you ever read vasopressin, antidiuretic hormone is what they're referring to. And I like calling it antidiuretic hormone or ADH because, well, diuretic, that means urinating or losing fluid. And I think it's a little bit more telling to, well, you know, like call it antidiuretic hormone because it's going to stop that, more or less. But that's the main hormone I want you to know that is coming from the posterior pituitary gland. Going back thinking about the hypothalamus just a little bit, it simulates the release of hormones from the anterior pituitary gland and provides hormones for release from the posterior pituitary gland. That probably nothing that's too much of a big deal that we need to understand there. Really the main thing I want you to know about ACTH, or adrenocorticotropic hormone, is its relationship to cortisol. So it will functionally bind to the adrenals, which, you know, are right above your kidneys, you know. So wherever your kidneys are, the adrenals are right on top of them. That's what adrenal means. And that's going to have them release the cortisol from the adrenal cortex. So adrenal medulla, that's going to be epinephrine, norepinephrine. We'll get into that. Luteinizing hormone, that stimulates the production of testosterone from testicles in males and estrogen from ovaries in females, you know, so cool stuff there. Thyroid stimulating hormone, or TSH. We'll talk a little bit about T4 and T3, the different flavors of thyroid hormone, but more or less I want you to understand that as being more or less of a permissive hormone, not really having much of an effect in regard to exercise, but growth hormone. So right here, the main functions of hormones, these things. So the first and foremost, maintain blood glucose. That one is a huge deal, because glucose under, you know, most conditions is the primary, the primary fuel for the nervous system and your brain. So if your brain doesn't get enough fuel, lights out. So maintains blood glucose. Also maintains plasma volume through manipulation of different electrolytes. So this will be like aldosterone types of things, so sodium, potassium, calcium being really important. Another thing being directing nutrient delivery. So we'll see like epinephrine will shut down nutrient transports to particular like cell types and direct it towards other cell types. Last and certainly not least, man, that's a cliche thing to say, but whatever. Growth and repair. So those are the four things that are happening in regards to hormones. So whenever we're going forward, like pay attention to their function, and their functions are almost always going to be something to do with these. Some things a little bit more, some things a little bit less. Like growth hormone, for example. It really doesn't have much of an effect on plasma volume, but does quite a bit with glucose, growth and repair, and nutrient delivery. And what happens in terms of exercise duration and intensity, which we'll, you know, get into. So growth hormone, to the effect that it has any anabolic effects, this is mostly what it's doing. It stimulates the release of IGF-1 which growth hormone from the anterior pituitary gland goes down, hits the liver, and then the liver releases IGF-1 into the bloodstream, and that can bind up to the top of the AKT-mTOR pathway and essentially stimulate protein synthesis. Growth hormone, it's also essential for amino acid uptake and protein synthesis to somewhat of a lesser degree. Also long bone formation, there's a lot of growth hormone receptors in, say, your femurs or your humeri. Yeah, sure, sure. But here, in regards to acute exercise, it is really a big deal in sparing plasma glucose. So it opposes insulin action to reduce the use of plasma glucose, so making it to where we maintain blood glucose. It also increases gluconeogenesis. It mobilizes fatty acids from adipose tissue. So overall, what it's doing, it's making different cells not use glucose and use fat instead, and makes the liver make more glucose. So that's kind of the main thing that it's doing, is trying to make it to where we have higher amounts of glucose in the blood. So overall, like, here are some things that are kind of stimulating it. So exercise actually stimulates the hypothalamus. Sleep, stress, like stress actually stimulates the hypothalamus. That's kind of cool. Low plasma glucose can also stimulate it. This is where people say that, like, intermittent fasting stimulates growth hormone, because intermittent fasting lowers blood glucose. So really, it doesn't increase it that much. Fairly small effect. But there is, like, a stimulus here, hypothalamus. It doesn't really. This doesn't matter if you know somatostatin or growth hormone releasing hormone, but those have an effect on the anterior pituitary gland. Then growth hormone gets stimulated. It'll hit the liver. Insulin-like growth factor comes out, IGF-1, stimulates protein synthesis and growth. GH, or growth hormone, has an effect there as well. Also increases gluconeogenesis in the liver and blocks glucose entry into adipose fat cells to favor fat mobilization. So, growth hormone increases synthesis in muscle and long bone, so interesting stuff. So some questions about growth hormone and performance. Early studies showed minimal strength gains compared to resistance training alone. So it doesn't seem to have much of an effect. Now, it does seem to have an additive effect whenever people take testosterone along with it. And also, growth hormone seems to selectively stimulate the synthesis of tendons and ligaments, so protein synthesis in tendons and ligaments. So it does seem to, I don't know, like, increase the density or diameter of different tendons, which, you know, is a good thing if, you know, trying to not get injured, right? Now here, this is effectively what we're saying right here, how it stimulates the collagen synthesis in human tendon and skeletal muscle without affecting myofibrillar, myofibril, that's a difficult word for me to say, protein synthesis. So this was a study from 2010. So the idea here is collagen synthesis, that's just tendons, more or less, and myofibrillar, that being like muscles, right? So kind of what's going on here, man, why do I do that? So there's type 1 collagen, type 3 collagen, recombinant human growth hormone stimulates that quite a bit, so the mRNA, the transcription level of it, man, I need to stop doing that. Tendon collagen protein synthesis, so exercise does it a little bit, but if you take growth hormone, it does it more, right? Here, muscle collagen, that's probably not. Really, I'm kind of beating a dead horse right here. Yeah, here's the take home right here. Like, this being muscle growth, so like actually like myosin, so fractional synthesis rate, exercise stimulates it more than just taking growth hormone. So really that's kind of the idea behind that. Yeah, collagen synthesis goes up quite a bit. So GH and IGF-1 may be more biologically important for supporting the supportive matrix in tissues than muscle cell hypertrophy and adult musculotendinous tissue. So I think that that's more or less the take home there. So, all right, so we're done talking about human growth hormone, and we'll circle back to it with what's happening in terms of exercise duration. Typically, it goes up in regard to exercise duration, and exercise intensity. More intense exercise typically increases growth hormone the most. So we'll circle back to that, but let's go ahead and move on to the posterior pituitary gland. The main thing that I want you to know here is the antidiuretic hormone, or vasopressin, as we said before. Sorry. The things going on here, it reduces water loss from the body to maintain plasma volume. So it essentially makes it to where we're going to urinate less and maybe sweat less. So it release also stimulated by high plasma osmolality and low plasma volume. So it can be stimulated by like high amounts of salt that we consume. So that's one way to do it. So high amounts of salt, meaning that like trying to balance out how much salt we have versus how much fluid that we have. So really this is mainly like the hormone that's making us not pee or sweat very much. So it increases during exercise right around 60% of VO2 max. So that's about where it actually gets kicked on. So around a fairly moderate intensity. Here we go. So this is functionally what's going on here. So at lower levels of exercise, and actually there is some evidence that at really low levels of exercise that it actually dips quite a bit. So if anybody has ever, I don't know, started walking like fairly low level exercise, if you start walking and then all of a sudden realize that you have to pee, that might be due to a depressed antidiuretic hormone. But right around 60% of VO2 max, it starts skyrocketing. So I don't know if anyone has ever went out and if you've ever had to urinate and then ran a 400-meter dash as fast as you possibly can, you know, like really high amounts of your VO2 max, probably over 100%. Yeah, well, I mean, you won't have to pee whenever you're done unless your bladder's about to explode. So that's really all I want you to know about antidiuretic hormone, posterior pituitary gland. That's the main relationship in terms of exercise intensity. All right, so moving on a little bit here to thyroid hormone. So this is stimulated by TSH, so thyroid stimulating hormone. And then both of these have iodine in them. So iodized salt, that's really why we consume that, so that we have sufficient amounts of thyroid hormone so we don't get a condition called goiter. You can look it up if you want to. But it's related to establishment of metabolic rate, and I'm not going to get into it too much, but it really just permits the full effect of other hormones, meaning that it's a permissive hormone. So it's it really doesn't change in regard to exercise, but you know, it does seem to be permissive, like allowing other hormones to do their function. Other two hormones, like parathyroid gland related, so calcitonin and parathyroid hormone, both of these are related to maintenance of calcium, one of the most tightly regulated, well, probably the most tightly regulated ion in our blood at any given time. So calcitonin, putting the calcium into bone. So what calcitonin does It blocks release from the bone, meaning that it's going to keep calcium inside of the bone, and it's also going to increase the excretion, so going to make an individual urinate it out more. So really what calcitonin is doing, it's trying to make it to where the amount of calcium in your bloodstream goes down. So meaning like putting it into bones, blocking the release from bones, and also urinating it out. Parathyroid hormone, this doesn't change during exercise, but it has a lot to do with calcium regulation. So release from bone and reabsorption in the kidneys. So this is trying to make it to where we have a higher amount of calcium in our blood. So here, a little bit of stuff going on. Really the main thing that I want you to understand here is that T3, this one right here, that's the more active form. So T4 is more or less the nascent or inactive form of thyroid hormone, and T3 is the more active form. So that's really all I want you to understand there. Here we already talked about parathyroid hormone a little bit. Really all that this is doing is trying to increase the amount of calcium within your blood, and it does it through these different mechanisms. You can read it. I'm not going to read it to you right now. There. Now let's move into the adrenal medulla. Some really interesting stuff going on here. So adrenal, so that's our little kidney bean, right? And then the adrenal gland right on top of it. And there's really two particular aspects to the adrenal gland that are really important. The adrenal cortex, that has a lot to do with cortisol. The adrenal medulla, epinephrine, norepinephrine. That's really how I want you to think about it. So the adrenal medulla, what's coming out of here are called the catecholamines. So epinephrine or adrenaline, if you want to call it that, or norepinephrine, or noradrenaline, if you want to call it that. all of those are fine. I prefer epinephrine and norepinephrine. So these are very fast-acting hormones. And they bind to particular receptors called adrenergic receptors. So do not confuse adrenergic with androgen receptors. So androgen receptors, that would be what, like say, testosterone binds to, or estrogen. But like epinephrine, norepinephrine, these bind to adrenergic, which are different. And overall, there's two different types. There's an alpha and a beta adrenergic receptor. More or less, how that is alpha, that's the brake, beta is the gas pedal. That's more or less how I want you to think about it. Now there's a beta 1, beta 2, beta 3, alpha 1, alpha 2, all sorts of things like that. And particular ones are present in different tissue types, like a beta 3 receptor is like only in fat tissue, whereas a beta 2 is like in your lungs, like bronchioles and things. That's not really important for what I'm talking about with this, but, you know, interesting nonetheless, I think. But the effects of it depend on the hormone used and the receptor type. So if it's epinephrine or norepinephrine, and which one it's binding to. So here, if we're looking, beta 1, 2, 3, all of these direction going up, 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 up. Alphas, direction going, well, vasoconstriction, meaning less blood flow. So, I mean, that could be an arrow going down. And then alpha 2, lower insulin secretion. So if if we just think about this in a particular way, so like beta 1, heart rate, glycogenolysis, and lipolysis. So that means that it's on the SA node, glycogen. All right, so that means it's on the liver, and also on skeletal muscle. Lipolysis on fat, right? And it seems like those have approximately an equal effect. Beta 2, Bronchodilation, vasodilation, so lungs is kind of what we're thinking here. Epinephrine a little bit more than norepinephrine. Now beta 3, this one just increasing lipolysis, and that one is just on fat tissue. Pretty interesting here, and norepinephrine having a stronger effect than epinephrine. Now these alphas, those are effectively like turning down. So vasoconstriction, this is why we have less blood flow to, like, say, our gastrointestinal tract whenever we're exercising, and that's due to the alpha-1 receptors on different, like, cell types in the GI tract. Right. So moving on there a little bit, we'll get to what all of that's doing here soon. Now let's talk about the adrenal cortex. So right here, broadly. Broadly, the things that I want you to know from here are the mineralocorticoids and the glucocorticoids. So the mineral one, meaning aldosterone, this coming from the adrenal cortex, maintenance of sodium and potassium. Glucocorticoids, cortisol. That's so glucocorticoids. That means that its primary function is regulating glucose. So this one regulates minerals. So if you don't know, sodium and potassium are minerals, and if you don't know, glucose is glucose. So that's it's a bit on the nose there. But those are the two main things going on here. From the adrenal cortex, aldosterone regulates sodium and potassium, essentially increases the reuptake of it so we don't urinate it out. And cortisol goes up to spare muscle glucose, or not muscle glucose, blood glucose, sorry. Aldosterone, so this is through, something to associate with this is the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. I'm not going to get into it too much. The main things I want you to know here: it controls sodium reabsorption and potassium secretion. So it's stimulated by increased potassium concentration and decreased plasma volume. So that's really all I want you to know about it. So renin, angiotensin, aldosterone. These are three different hormones. I'm sorry, I'm hopping all over the place right now. But they all typically go up in regard to exercise. So aldosterone, renin, and angiotensin 2. There's an angiotensin 1, but we're not going to get into it. In regard to exercise intensity, the more intense you go, the higher these go. So maintenance of minerals within our blood. Next thing, glucose, or cortisol, the so-called stress hormone. Really, these are the main things that it's actually doing. So maintenance of plasma glucose, and it does it through a couple of different things. So it promotes protein breakdown for gluconeogenesis. So if you put a bunch of cortisol onto a muscle, it's going to break down a lot of the amino acids on it. It also stimulates free fatty acid mobilization, and it stimulates glucose synthesis, which is just gluconeogenesis. It also blocks uptake of glucose into cells, and it's stimulated by stress. So it's part of the general adaptation syndrome, or the GAS. I'll show you a picture of that here in a bit. Stress via adrenocorticotropic hormone and exercise. So overall here, like general adaptation syndrome, if you've ever heard of this, this is more or less what it is. We have a general homeostasis, we have an alarm stage, we have a resistance stage, and an exhaustion stage. So I just wanted to, likely you've heard about this in other classes, but that's what I want you to know there. So cortisol, control of it is all of these like plus signs, so exercise, bone breaks, burns, so-called stress. All of that stimulates the hypothalamus, and then the anterior pituitary gland gets stimulated. Then adrenocorticotropic hormone stimulates the adrenal cortex, and then cortisol finally does all of these things. And here, I don't think I pointed this out before, but cortisol, it goes back and binds to the anterior pituitary gland and the hypothalamus, this being a negative feedback loop. So hopefully that makes sense. But here are the 4 things that cortisol does broadly. So amino acids, gluconeogenesis, blood glucose uptake, mobilizes free fatty acids. Mostly what it's doing is trying to maintain blood glucose. So if we burn fat instead of glucose, that's maintaining it. That's just how that works. It can't go into a cell. That means it's going to stay in our blood. Right there. So here's a particular question. Various people will talk about cortisol being bad, which it's only bad if it's chronically elevated to a small degree. So chronic cortisol elevation is bad, but acute is actually pretty good. So there was a study in 2012 looking at all of the different hormones. So like after you exercise, testosterone goes up, growth hormone goes up, cortisol goes up quite a bit. And the only hormone that was actually predictive of how much muscle mass someone grew after exercise bouts was cortisol. So after exercise, the amount of growth hormone or the amount of testosterone that you have circulating has nothing to do with how much muscle mass that an individual can grow. However, the amount of cortisol actually does. Like if you ever read on, the interwebs or whatever about, hey, do these exercises because it stimulates growth hormone or testosterone more. Nonsense. Nonsense. It's like that has such a paltry small effect that it doesn't matter. Really, cortisol is probably the biggest thing there. Now, cortisol is not in and of itself anabolic. It's just really indicative of, well, you did a workout that was hard. That was really hard, and that's probably what stimulates muscle growth the most. So here, lean body mass. Here, type 2 muscle fiber cross-sectional area. That's what that means. So moving on there. All right, so here going on, and like just a reminder, take breaks whenever you need to, because I know that this is getting long. But adipose tissue or fat, we used to think of it as effectively just an inert storage of calories, like just storing lipids and stuff. But it actually does quite a few things. It functions as an endocrine gland, and there's just like 2 hormones that I want you to know about it, leptin and adiponectin. So leptin, a lot of times we think about this as something that controls our appetite, which works kind of counter to ghrelin, a hormone from our stomach that tells us that we're hungry. And leptin, once a fat cell has enough fuel within it, it secretes leptin, basically telling you that, hey, we have enough storage of fat, so we're good. But it also enhances insulin sensitivity and fatty acid oxidation, so that's kind of cool stuff. And adiponectin does both those 2 things. So really, I just want you to have a word association with these, because going forward, leptin and adiponectin are, there's quite a bit of research going on with them, and exercise effects on these things. So with increased fat mass or obesity, there does seem to be a higher level of leptin and a lower level of adiponectin. So there does seem to be a Goldilocks zone to where we have fairly high levels of both. Now, this higher level of leptin, I just said that increases insulin sensitivity and fatty acid oxidation. It seems like obese individuals become what's called leptin insensitive, a lot like insulin insensitive. So you can look that stuff up more, like send me an email, ask me a question, sorry. understand more about that. If you're interested, I just wanted to talk about this a little bit. But like that does lead to type 2 diabetes. You know, something I'm fascinated with, and low-grade inflammation. Come on. There. Okay. Now let's move on to the pancreas. So it has both exocrine and endocrine functions. So I don't know. I'm not going to talk about that too much. Really, the main things that I want us to know are insulin. Comes from the beta cells of the pancreas, and glucagon comes from the alpha cells of the pancreas. And the primary functions here, insulin promotes storage. So insulin is a very anabolic or building hormone. So promotes storage of glucose, amino acids, and fats. So it aids in all of those. So having more glycogen, having more muscle, having more fat. Everything's getting bigger. Glucagon, basically the opposite of that, but mostly to do with fatty acids and glucose. Doesn't seem to have much of an effect on amino acids. It might do a little bit of gluconeogenesis in the liver, but that's really neither here nor there. Somatostatin, we're not going to talk about that, and bicarbonate and digestive enzymes. Pancreatic amylase, all of those things. I talked about that in other classes, but not this one so much. All right, so those were the main things with insulin and glucagon that we need to know. We will circle back to what's going on with all of that here soon. Next things, testosterone, estrogen, and progesterone. So first off, testosterone, it's released from the testes. Now, like women do make it to lower degrees. There's two different words that I want you to be aware of. So anabolic, that means building, and androgenic means more or less masculine characteristics. So like hair growth on the face and things like that. So know those two different distinctions. So yeah, there. Estrogen and progesterone, something that I think I actually learned somewhat recently. Progesterone, it's kind of hard to recall what progesterone actually does, but whenever you think about it, think pro or promoting gestation or, growth of babies within a womb and things. So I think that's a good way to think about it. Now, estrogen actually has quite a few effects that are fairly interesting. It actually alters a little bit how fatty acid oxidation works, but I'm not going to get into that too much, if at all. But both these are released from the ovaries, establish and maintain reproductive function. Levels vary throughout the menstrual cycle, so those kind of go up and down. Now, I mean, on the somewhat male side, testosterone goes up and down throughout the day, and well, I'm not going to talk too much about that because it could get inappropriate, so not feeling it right now. So here, GRH, hypothalamus, anterior pituitary gland. There's a few things going on here, but we're thinking about testosterone, male secondary sex characteristics. All of that goes up too high, then anterior pituitary gland and hypothalamus get shut down. Yeah, not too much that I'm really wanting to talk about there. Estrogen, here are a couple of things going on here. Deposition of fat to the thighs, buttocks, breast development, develop of the egg, ovum. Just some kind of interesting things going on. Looking at a couple of different hormones throughout here. Really, I just want you to get an appreciation for this. During the menstrual cycle, there's two phases of it, the follicular and luteal phase. Now, hopefully some reproductive class talks about that a little bit more. But the follicular phase, there is a slightly different hormonal response to exercise intensity and for the follicular phase versus the luteal phase. So here, a little bit more progesterone going up, here in the purple. And here, progesterone and estrogen are about equal. A little bit less estrogen in the follicular phase, but in the luteal phase, they're about equal, going up at somewhat of a similar rate in response to exercise intensity. So, here, I'd just kind of an interesting thing going on. Like overall with the general cycle, this might seem counter to what I just said, but there are, like within the follicular phase, just generally it seems to be a little bit more dominated by estrogen. The luteal phase seems to be dominated a little bit more by progesterone, and the ovulation day, a lot of things seem to spike, particularly testosterone. So I'm not going to get into that too much. But like here are just a couple of things to be aware of. So estrogen actually is anabolic in many ways. So there have been studies of individuals taking aromatase inhibitors, which makes it to where testosterone does not convert to estrogen. And it seems to actually blunt muscle growth whenever individuals take aromatase inhibitors. So I don't know. It's I just want you to be aware of that. Like estrogen is a fairly interesting hormone, and like postmenopausal women, a lot of the problems that they have is due to a lack of estrogen. Progesterone overall increases body temperature, and both have interactions with fluid retention. And there was a really interesting study. If anybody knows what amenorrhea is, it means loss of the menstrual cycle. Apparently, I can't remember if it's 3, 4, or 7 days, but a couple of days of consuming 30 kilocalories per kilogram of lean body mass seems to cure amenorrhea. So just put that in your back pocket, and like know that if you're ever working with female athletes that are particularly lean and doing a lot of exercise, this might be a thing that could help them. Some other things to be a little bit aware of. There is some controversy about how how shall I put this? Females have, what is it, like a 4 to 6 times higher rate of ACL tears, and it could be due to a whole array of things. But here's potentially one. So vastus medialis or vastus medialis obliquus, like really just different aspects of like the quad. There is a slightly different firing pattern at different stages of the menstrual cycle. So if you're working with particular athletes, there might be a higher risk of ACL or knee injury at different stages of the menstrual cycle. So that it's a bit controversial, and truthfully, I see data going for this and against this all the time. So I really don't know, but there does seem to be at least some evidence that this could be a thing, somewhat. Also heart rate variability, which is effectively just how how recovered an individual is. We'll talk a little bit more about heart rate variability and whenever I talk about heart functioning. But effectively, it's just the distance between heartbeats, and the more variable the distance is, you know, having a short distance, long distance, that more or less just means that you're recovered more. So that's heart rate variability. If it's fairly consistent, then that means that you're a little less recovered. So this pretty much is just saying that the results of this particular study demonstrate that heart rate variability is highest prior to ovulation, and that this variability decreases until the onset of the new menstrual cycle. So maybe prior to ovulation, females might have difficulty recovering from really high load exercise, but really, I, I don't think that this is abundantly true, because measuring heart rate variability, I think, is a really hit or miss type of thing. But just this is an idea that I want you to at least be aware of. Now here, I just wanted to talk about anabolic steroids just a little bit. So crazily, initial studies of this, probably because they didn't know how to do it yet, showed no benefit for developing muscle mass. Now I think anybody who doesn't believe in the tooth fairy anymore understands that anabolic steroids, or taking testosterone, it being bound to various esters, well, here, I guess I'll say that. So like free testosterone, if you just inject normal testosterone, it only stays in your bloodstream for like a couple of minutes. That's why people will bind it to particular things like testosterone enanthate. That's an ester, or testosterone cypionate. That makes it last for approximately a week. So maybe that was an issue. So initial studies showed no benefits to it. There were, it is associated with some negative side effects. So, like inability to make sperm anymore, so effectively not being able to have children later on in life, maybe some other issues. Yeah, I'm not sure I believe that, but here's just a particular study that I want everyone to be aware of. So it was a study back in 1996. This is a very classic study about muscle mass growth and also strength. So here, if we pay attention to this, these bars here, these are no exercise, taking testosterone, or not taking testosterone. So placebo, taking testosterone, I believe it was 600 milligrams of testosterone enanthate. Now on the other side, this is exercise. So placebo versus actually taking testosterone and exercising, it's just lifting weights. So let's look at what's going on here. So I want to draw your attention to this and that. So an individual who does not exercise and takes testosterone versus an individual who does not take testosterone and exercises, lifting weights, you gain more muscle mass if you just take testosterone and don't exercise. Now there is an additive effect right there. So that means that the hormones are driving quite a bit. And a lot of it is actually driven in the upper body. So there's really virtually no difference between tricep growth in individuals who take testosterone and don't exercise, and individuals that take testosterone and do exercise. So that's a bit crazy. Now the reason for that, androgen receptors. There are more androgen receptors in the upper body. Now in the lower body, there's a little bit less, showing that like the difference between quad growth for people who took testosterone and don't exercise, and individuals who just exercise and don't take testosterone, virtually no difference there. So it does seem like legs, well, you have to actually train them for them to grow. Now up here, I find this interesting. Bench pressing, just taking testosterone, you get just as much strength as people who actually train bench pressing if you're taking testosterone. So I don't know, I think that's fairly interesting. The only place where training actually beat taking testosterone was in squatting strength. So I don't know, just bear that in mind. I think it's kind of interesting. This, I'm not going to talk about this too much. There seems to be a additive effect of testosterone and growth hormone. You can read this study if you want to. I think it's a great study, but I am going a bit long. So now here, I just show you this to indicate the difference between testosterone and estradiol, or estrogen as we would commonly call it? Well, they don't look any different to me. Now granted, these carbon rings are different, but that is the primary functional difference between testosterone and estrogen, that it's virtually invisible to the naked eye. Now, I mean, it is all made out of cholesterol. Now, we do make cholesterol in our bodies, in our yeah, and we also can consume it in the diet. So I don't know, like a lot of things going on there. I'm really not going to talk about that too much. Now, here's a question that has always bothered me, that people talk about. It's the idea of roid rage. Is roid rage real? So, I want all of you to think about this. It's probably not real, and here is why. So, it would have to decrease afferent inhibitory signaling from the prefrontal cortex to the amygdala, and it doesn't do that. Like, if anything, it enhances neuronal signaling. We'll get into absolute and relative refractory periods, but it actually condenses absolute refractory periods so that, well, it actually increases reaction time. So it probably, like anabolic steroids, or roids so-called, probably don't make someone mean or a bad person. Just frequently people who are already mean and, bad people start taking steroids. So that's really what's going on there. Now one thing here, St. Patrick's Day happened not too long ago. Alcohol does do this. So alcohol actually does decrease signaling from the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex to the amygdala, which just go to Wikipedia, look up what those things do. They're fairly important, I think. So alcohol actually does increase aggression in people, unlike testosterone or anabolic steroids. Okay. So, all right. So we talked about adipose tissue as an endocrine gland. Now I want to talk about skeletal muscle as an endocrine gland. So skeletal muscle produces these signals called myokines. Whenever they contract frequently, it's to stimulate glucose uptake and fatty acid oxidation. It also promotes blood vessel growth and neocapillarization to effectively get more fuel to muscles. It can also go, these myokines can also be sent to the liver to enhance glucose production, and also to fat tissue to enhance triglyceride or fat breakdown, lipolysis, right? So this one thing here called IL-6, interleukin 6. Now, there's a lot of different interleukins, and I'm not going to get into them too much. But IL-6, typically we think of this as an inflammatory signal. Now, that's really only whenever it is in the presence of something called tumor necrosis factor alpha, or TNF-alpha. Now, this I don't think is super important for us, but in the context of where IL-6 is alone being secreted from skeletal muscle, it actually has an anti-inflammatory effect. So that's, well, hey, instead of taking Advil, do a bunch of push-ups. IL-6, anti-inflammatory effect. Kind of cool, right? At least I think it is. Regular exercise promotes an anti-inflammatory environment, which, chronic inflammation is related to type 2 diabetes, heart disease, certain cancers, all sorts of things, right? So again, one big picture of, truthfully, every class I ever teach is exercise is good for you, and there's just so many different ways to slice that it gets ridiculous. There. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about muscle glycogen utilization. So this term, glycogenolysis, this is the breakdown of muscle glycogen. So in exercise metabolism, we talked about this a lot, right? It's related to exercise intensity. So high intensity exercise results in greater and more rapid glycogen depletion. So epinephrine, particularly whenever it binds to a beta-1 adrenergic receptor, is a powerful stimulator of glycogenolysis. And we're going to get into the primary enzyme that somewhat regulates glycogen breakdown, glycogenolysis, and it's called glycogen phosphorylase. And it actually has like 2 different states that it's in. So like we'll get there here in a second. But glycogen depletion, that's really all I want you to understand here. So percent VO2 max is in here, and they do it until exhaustion. So if you exercise above VO2 max, 120% of VO2 max, we break down glycogen relatively rapidly. Versus on the other end, 30% of your VO2 max, we break down glycogen very slowly. It takes a long time to deplete it. So really, that's just to say that higher intensities for longer periods of time break down more glycogen. That has to be obvious, I think, right? Now, with those same things, how much epinephrine is stimulated or released during exercise? So here, higher intensity, over 100% of VO2 max, more epinephrine release in a shorter period of time, right? So, like with all of this, that's really just how I want you to understand that. Like higher intensity exercise, longer duration exercise, more epinephrine release, right? Now, control of muscle glycogen utilization is through 2 different things. So one, epinephrine, and the other, calcium. So epinephrine, this will stimulate our cyclic AMP second messenger cascade via beta-1 adrenergic receptors. Calcium, whenever a muscle is contracting, a lot of calcium is released from the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and that calcium will bind to this particular protein called calmodulin, and that will more or less stimulate like glycogen phosphorylase to be altered to where it's actually a little bit more functional. Well, here, propranolol, that's a beta blocker. I'm not going to ask you about any of that. So here, there's effectively 2 flavors of glycogen phosphorylase, this being the enzyme that breaks down glycogen to get it into glycolysis. So glycogen phosphorylase B is effectively the inert form, and then it's converted to glycogen phosphorylase A through 2 different mechanisms. So epinephrine, beta-adrenergic receptor, cyclic AMP, phosphorylase B to A. Sarcoplasmic reticulum, calcium release, glycogen phosphorylase B to phosphorylase A. So phosphorylase A is the one that is really stimulating glycogen breakdown. And the reason that I'm pointing this out is since there's 2 ways to do this, this must be a really important system. And I don't know, I guess I'll go back just for a little bit. The reason that these beta blockers are somewhat important because beta blockers effectively will make it to where epinephrine isn't released very much. And we still see quite a bit of glycogen breakdown in the presence of beta blockers. So if we don't have enough of this system, there is an internal system like that's going to increase this breakdown or this alteration so that glycogen is broken down a little bit more. So really important system. All right, so back we were talking about overall what a lot of hormones are doing. Really, there's effectively two classes of hormones being permissive or slow-acting and fast-acting hormones, and I think that this makes sense. So down here, well, like thyroid, cortisol, growth hormone, all of those are our slow-acting hormones. Our fast-acting ones are epinephrine, norepinephrine, insulin, and glucagon. Pretty much have immediate effects. What all of these guys are doing is these four things. So plasma glucose is maintained through these four processes. So mobilization of glucose from liver glycogen stores. So releasing that, mobilization of free fatty acids from adipose tissue. So all of these hormones have an effect on breaking down fat. Gluconeogenesis, all of these hormones have somewhat of an effect of making glucose from amino acids, lactic acid, or lactate if it's circulating in the blood, right? And glycerol. And then also blocking the entry of glucose into cells. So forces use of free fatty acids as fuel. Yeah, like I could talk about that a little bit. Various individuals that like I've known in my life have taken growth hormone, and they actually ended up being somewhat insulin, or I don't know, like insulin resistant, because that growth hormone is blocking glucose entry into a cell. So it's somewhat rare, but I have heard of it happening. That's pretty much neither here nor there. All right, so here with thyroid hormone, one of the permissive hormones, so T3, T4. So it acts in a permissive manner, allowing other hormones to exert their full effect. So T3 actually enhances the effect of epinephrine to mobilize free fatty acids from adipose tissue, but there's really no change in T3 or T4 during exercise. So that's kind of the main thing going on there. Cortisol, fairly slow-acting hormone. It has effects on stimulating free fatty acid mobilization from adipose tissue, enhancing gluconeogenesis. We've said all of this before, right? Now, two interesting things about the effect of exercise right here. At low-intensity exercise, we actually get a depression in cortisol, and at high-intensity exercise, an increase in it. So, what this means, at least to me, cortisol, you know, the so-called stress hormone, if we're trying to reduce that, you know, reduce our stress in some cases, which, you know, might be a good idea, like, well, I mean, especially now, going outside for a light walk or, you know, a stroll of some sort, a very low intensity, that might be beneficial in some ways of reducing cortisol. I don't know, like just somewhat of an idea there. So, yeah, related to repair, exercise-induced damage, yep. So overall, what's going on? Tissues increases free fatty acid oxidation, gets fat out of fat cells, gets protein out, or gets amino acids out of muscle cells so that we can have more glucose. That's more or less what's going on here. Like, look through this and try to understand it as best you can. Now, I already talked about plasma, or not plasma, sorry, the cortisol level, lower levels seeming to have an effect on decreasing lower levels of exercise intensity that seem to be decreasing cortisol. Now here, growth hormone, slow acting, just like cortisol. It actually supports the action of cortisol. It does almost all the same things. So there is an exercise effect, increase in plasma growth hormone with increased intensity. And there actually seems to be people that are more trained in a particular flavor of exercise seem to actually have a little bit more growth hormone in response to it. It's almost like the body is learning how to make more growth hormone. So you can read in your book a little bit more about that. I think it's pretty interesting. But outside of that, this is the main things I want you to know. More gluconeogenesis, more fatty acid breakdown, and more fatty acid oxidation, and less uptake of glucose inside of cells. So here, exercise intensity, percent VO2 max, greater increases in your growth hormone, and longer duration exercise, greater increases in growth hormone. So there is that. All right. So epinephrine, norepinephrine, insulin, glucagon being our fast-acting hormones. Let's talk about the catecholamines, epinephrine, norepinephrine, first. So these, in a very rapid fashion, maintain blood glucose through a couple of different things. So a shift from using blood glucose to muscle glycogen. So if we use the carbohydrate store that's already inside of a muscle, we won't be as reliant on the carbohydrate store that is external to the muscle, right? I think that kind of makes sense. Next one, increase in liver glucose mobilization, increase in free fatty acid mobilization, and it also can interfere with glucose uptake in cells that don't need it. That's really why we have the alpha 1 and 2 adrenergic receptor, is that particular cells that don't have much of a demand for glucose, they're effectively, for the lack of a better way to think about it, turned off, or we aren't going to funnel everything that direction, right? Now, plasma epinephrine and norepinephrine increased during exercise, and they decreased plasma epinephrine and norepinephrine following training. So that means that we seem to adapt to exercise training by exercising at the same intensity, that we have less of an epinephrine norepinephrine response. So here, in a very acute fast sense, this is what's happening. Liver, glycogen and glucose in the liver, so producing more of that, more free fatty acids in the blood, and blocking glucose entry into certain cells probably promotes it in other cells, but also increases fatty acid oxidation. So here, in terms of exercise duration, epinephrine and norepinephrine go up over time. Now, it does seem like norepinephrine has a larger effect, and that's probably due to, if anybody recalls looking at it, the beta-3 adrenergic receptor that's on like fat tissue, meaning that, well, like norepinephrine had a larger effect on that than epinephrine did. So the longer we exercise, more norepinephrine, more beta-3 adrenergic receptor activity, more lipolysis. So that's, I don't know, I think that's an interesting way to look at it. Now, weeks of training if you exercise at the same intensity. So think about it like this. If you're running at, 5 miles an hour, week 1, you'll have a lot of epinephrine, norepinephrine. Week 2, less. Week 3, less. Week 4, less. All of that type of stuff. So the nanograms per milliliter is going down. Next, insulin and glucagon are fast-acting pancreatic hormones from the beta cell of the pancreas, insulin, and alpha cell of the pancreas, glucagon. Just saying all that again. These fast-acting insulin, uptake, and storage of glucose, and free fatty acids and amino acids. This effectively works to lower the amount of blood glucose. Glucagon effectively serves to increase the amount of blood glucose. So here, let's look at those. Both of them have a decreased response following training, and really they're also heavily influenced by catecholamines, so epinephrine, norepinephrine. So epinephrine, norepinephrine can increase glucagon release and decrease insulin release. So here, a little bit differing effects on here. Like, really, here's the main thing. Like, insulin is putting glucose into all of these 3 cell types, and glucagon is taking glucose out of the liver, and fatty acids out of adipose tissue. Now notice, glucagon going up has no effect on skeletal muscle because it doesn't have the specific receptor for it. Now, what's going on here? Insulin goes down in response to like exercise intensity. So the more intense we exercise, the more it goes down. Now, it does seem to curve back up around there. I don't think that that's much of an effect for us to think about. During exercise, for long duration exercise, insulin also goes down, but it seems to go down less in more trained individuals. Now, glucagon, in terms of exercise duration, in untrained individuals, it'll go up quite a bit. In trained individuals, it'll really stay about the same. So there is a difference. And the more physically fit someone is, the less glucagon that they're actually going to produce in response to long duration exercise. Here, epinephrine, norepinephrine, they have effects on the alpha cells and beta cells. So talked about this before. I think this makes sense. Epinephrine, norepinephrine can increase plasma glucagon and decrease plasma insulin. This right here, effect of sympathetic nervous system on substrate mobilization during submaximal exercise. So sympathetic nervous system, so fight or flight, basically. I want you to think about epinephrine, norepinephrine, insulin down, glucagon up, more blood glucose, more free fatty acids. So really just liberating or setting loose all of the different fuels that we need in order to exercise. So here, overall, these are the hormone responses. So the harder we exercise, basically everything that we've talked about that's relevant, epinephrine, norepinephrine, growth hormone, cortisol, glucagon, goes up in relationship to exercise intensity, that's this left graph, and exercise duration, this right graph. And insulin more or less goes down for both of those. And that's, I think that is probably like where we're going to stop. I will talk about this just a little bit. So there is somewhat of a hormone substrate interaction with like free fatty acids and lactic acid. So here, let's go ahead and read this slide. I probably won't test too much about it, but the harder we exercise, we might actually decrease the amount of free fatty acids in our blood. And there is a particular idea for this that I think is kind of interesting. So within a fat cell, how we actually break down a triglyceride to get free fatty acids and glycerol, the main hormone there is called hormone-sensitive lipase, and that is stimulated by cyclic AMP, through epinephrine, norepinephrine, glucagon, and but something kind of interesting is that lactate somehow seems to have an effect on increasing the amount of free fatty acids that are put together with glycerol, so like synthesis of a triglyceride. The idea here is just that if we have a high amount of lactate in our blood, we probably don't have enough time to actually break down fat for fuel, so we're going to be almost entirely reliant on glucose. So it kind of makes sense that the more intense we exercise, and I'm talking very intensely, that there's going to be an effect of actually not having very much free fatty acids around. So that is really all I'm about to say on that. Thanks for listening to this, and I'll see you in the next lecture.